All right, so we've got this India-Canada situation, right? It's kind of blown up, but everyone's talking about it. Accusations flying around, diplomats being recalled, the whole thing. But what's really going on here? Like, what's at the heart of all this drama?
Yeah, it's wild how quickly things escalated. Went from like 0 to 60 in a flash, huh? We're going to try to unpack all of this. We're going to be looking at this article from the Tribune. It's an Indian newspaper. See if we can get a better sense of what's fueling the fire.
Okay, sounds good. So one thing the Tribune article really points to is the Khalistan Movement. They're saying that's a major source of the tension. Now, for anyone who might not be familiar, we're talking about this movement that's advocating for an independent Sikh homeland, right? And we're talking about the Punjab region, which actually spans parts of both India and Pakistan.
Right. And it's important to remember that this movement, it comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of history, and honestly, a lot of tragedy, too. Like, you can't talk about this without thinking about the 1985 Air India bombing, that horrific act of terrorism that killed 329 people. Many of them were Canadians, by the way. Just a devastating event.
Yeah, absolutely terrible. And speaking of Canada, the Tribune piece, it quotes this Canadian security expert. And his argument is interesting. He says Western nations, Canada included, they tend to downplay India's concerns about Khalistani extremism. And the reason, he suggests, is because it doesn't directly threaten them.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. A threat that feels like it's on the other side of the world. It's easy to see how that might not feel very urgent, you know. But for India, this isn't some abstract idea. It's a very real national security concern and a painful reminder of tragedies like the Air India bombing.
Right, absolutely. And it gets even more complicated because the article even suggests that Canada might be like blurring the lines between Sikhism as a religion and Khalistan, the separatist movement. And they're saying that that could lead to some serious misunderstandings. What do you make of that?
Yeah, no, that's a really crucial point. I mean, imagine judging a whole religion based on the actions of like a small extremist group. It just doesn't make sense. It's dangerous, frankly. And this article, it really seems to be saying that this kind of confusion might actually be at play here.
For sure. And that kind of leads us to the next layer of this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Could internal Canadian politics be playing a role in how they're dealing with all of this?
Well, you got to consider that Canada has a large Sikh population, right? Which means, politically speaking, they're a significant voting bloc. And the article, it brings up this poll that found that a staggering 9 out of 10 Canadians were either unaware of the Air India bombing or knew very little about it.
Wow, 9 out of 10, that's a pretty big knowledge gap, especially given what happened. It makes you wonder, I mean, could that lack of awareness be influencing how the Canadian government's responding?
It's definitely possible. Like, if the government doesn't feel like an issue is a major concern for its own citizens, do they feel the same urgency to address it, even if it's a huge deal for another country? That's kind of a classic dilemma in international relations.
For sure. It's a real balancing act. Now, speaking of international relations, the article contrasts Canada's approach with how the United States is handling things. What can you tell me about that?
Well, so the U.S. has also encouraged India to cooperate with Canada's investigation into the death of this Khalistani leader, who India has designated as a terrorist, by the way. But, and this is key, they've done it while at the same time really emphasizing their strong relationship with India. It's a very different tone. So
it's almost like the U.S. is trying to walk this diplomatic tightrope, trying to acknowledge both sides without fully picking a side.
Exactly. It's high-stakes diplomacy for sure, and the U.S. is clearly trying to, maintain those relationships with both countries. Can they pull it off? Good question.
Yeah. And I think even more importantly, what does all this mean for the future of these relationships? Like, what are the potential consequences here? We're going to dig into all of that right after this. Okay, so we're really starting to see how, all this stuff is tangled up together, right? We've got these historical tensions, internal politics, global perceptions, and it's all feeding into this India-Canada standoff. But what's next? I mean, where does this go from here? What are the potential consequences of this whole diplomatic blow-up?
Well, the article from the Tribune seems to think that both India and Canada will probably take a wait-and-see approach, at least for now.
And why is that?
Well, for one thing, you got to think about the economics of it all, right? Those ties run deep. I mean, you've got the Indian diaspora in Canada, the money coming in from Indian international students. That's a lot of incentive to try and smooth things over.
Yeah, for sure. But even with that, I mean, it's hard to imagine there won't be any fallout from all of this. So what could that look like? What are some potential long-term consequences, particularly for Canada?
That's where it gets really interesting. Imagine for a second, you're another country, right? And maybe you're dealing with your own issues, say a separatist movement, and some of that support is coming from within Canada. How do you think they're going to view how Canada's handling this situation with India?
So you're saying they might see this and think, okay, so Canada's willing to be pretty accommodating when it comes to this Khalistan movement. Will they be as understanding with our concerns, even if it puts them in a tough spot with India?
It could definitely set a precedent, create this ripple effect on a global scale, you know?
Wow. So it's almost like everybody's watching this situation closely, trying to figure out where the lines are being drawn and what that means for them. This is some serious high-stakes diplomacy we're talking about.
No doubt. And I think this is where clear, open communication becomes even more important. Like, that's gotta be a priority.
Diplomacy, right. But isn't that easier said than done in this kind of situation? When there's so much tension, so much history.
Of course, it's never easy, right? But it's even more crucial when emotions are running high. Leaders need to avoid playing politics with these things and really focus on de-escalation. Find some common ground, you know?
So it's about remembering that diplomacy isn't just about governments, it's about people. And speaking of people, what about the human cost of this whole standoff?
Yeah, that's a really important point. We can get so caught up in this geopolitical chess game that we forget about the real people caught in the middle. I mean, you've got the Indian diaspora in Canada, families with connections to both countries, students, business people, their lives, their livelihoods are being directly impacted by this whole thing.
It's a good reminder that behind the headlines, there are human stories playing out. Personal experiences shaped by these events. It's easy to forget that.
Absolutely.
It really is. I mean, you talk about countries, we talk about international relations, but at the end of the day, this stuff, it's about people, right? About relationships between people. And when those relationships get all messed up, it's people who really feel it.
Yeah, exactly. And it reminds us that diplomacy, at its core, it's about understanding, you know, finding some empathy, even when you disagree.
Which, let's be honest, it's not easy. Especially these days, it seems like everything's getting spun up on social media, harder and harder to separate what's real from what's like totally made up.
Tell me about it. It's like trying to have a conversation in a room full of people just screaming at the top of their lungs.
Right. So how do we even begin to like bridge those divides, find some common ground when there's so much noise?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It takes a real effort from everybody involved. Leaders, they got to prioritize honesty, open dialogue, forget the political gamesmanship, you know?
Now, what about the rest of us? What can we do?
We've got a responsibility too. It's on us to be critical of what we're reading, what we're seeing, you know. Find different perspectives. Don't just stick to your own echo chamber. And have those tough conversations, even when it's uncomfortable.
Because at the end of the day, when you understand something, it's easier to find some empathy. And that's how you start finding solutions that work for everybody.
Exactly. And this whole situation, India and Canada, it really just shows how complex things are. It's rarely simple, right? You can't just point and say, okay, these are the good guys, those are the bad guys. But if we can wrap our heads around that complexity and really talk to each other, honestly, we can start building bridges instead of more walls.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive, it's been really eye-opening, I gotta say. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, historical tensions, the political calculations, the human cost, all of it. But more than anything, I hope it's gotten people thinking, that you're a little more curious about what's going on in the world. So next time you see a headline, don't just scroll past it, you know. Dig a little deeper, have those conversations. It's important. That's all from us for now. Thanks for listening.